Coming up on Big Ten today, Jake Budd is with me. The CFP rankings are out. What it all means to the Big Ten heading into one of the biggest games of the year. Huge rivalry game in LA this week. Our urban analysis tells us what to expect as the Bruins and Trojans square off for the victory bell. And in a season that's seen a number of mid-season changes, we'll evaluate ones that have had the biggest impact. On Big Ten today, now. Welcome in. It is Big Ten today on a Wednesday. We are presented by Gatorade. Great to have you with us. Dave Rebson alongside Jake Budd. The new CFP rankings are out. This week felt a little bit like the calm before the storm because obviously we're going to have some change from the Big Ten's perspective next week.
Yeah, I mean, just how we drew it up, Dave. Everyone had this one circled. Indiana, Ohio State. This is exactly what we expected. This was going to be the game that's going to decide the conference. Maybe Signetti might have been the only one on the planet.
That was literally what I was going to say when you stopped talking. Was there was one person who did believe that this would be the game of the year, and that was Curt Signetti. We'll get to that game in just a moment, but first let's set the scene for you with the new CFP rankings, which are, as you would imagine, our big story. They look alarmingly similar to last week's from the Big Ten perspective. Once again, 4 of the top 5 ranked teams are from the Big Ten, the only conference ever to do that. The rankings remain the same. Oregon 1, OSU 2, Penn State 4, Indiana 5. The only change this week is there's a 5th Big Ten team in there, Illinois, debuting at number 25. Now remember, the bracket differs from the seedings as no conference can have more than one top 4 seed. Those are reserved for conference champs. So Oregon is the 1 seed, but Ohio State would be the 5 despite being ranked 2nd. Penn State and Indiana both 2 spots lower in the seedings than in the rankings. All 3 of the Big Ten teams that would have to play in the first round would host their games were these rankings to hold. So, Jake, what's the biggest thing from your point of view that stands out from a Big Ten perspective?
Okay, real quick, when you look at that bracket, the 5 seed is what a great place to be.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
That's the biggest thing that stands out to me.
Yes.
Perfect place.
You know, you ever listen to like Warren Buffett talk about his investment analysis, like buying value, right?
Right.
So the loser of the Big Ten championship, whether it's Oregon, Ohio State, or Indiana, like that, the loser will be that's the second best team in college football. But because of the buys, they would drop down to the 5th seed. So there's the Warren Buffett philosophy. You're going to get great value, and you're hosting a playoff game against the 12 seed and then playing the lowest rated of the teams that have a bye. So you look at that, if it plays out just like this, Ohio State has an amazing path.
Perfect.
You hear some coaches talk about Lane Kiffin talking about he can see a future where coaches may rest guys in their conference title games, because he said it doesn't matter.
Or he was even saying he went a step further than that. He said they didn't want to play in.
Might not be right, exactly. And I get it, right? Like that's a conversation that will probably, as we embrace the change of college football, conversation is going to continue to heat up. So I understand it. My big takeaway, though, besides this, and this is the big conversation of the loser of Ohio State, Indiana. What's their resume going to look like? And you can already hear Kirby Smart. He sounds like a politician, and I get it. If I was in his shoes, I'd be doing the exact same thing. So I understand. That's his job. They're trying to set the stage to bump Indiana out if they lose. Here's my problem with this argument. The way the SEC, there's that side of the SEC, the pundits and the experts, they speak as if it's a certainty and a given that the SEC is just better than the rest. As if, why play these games? They talk about, well, Georgia would be favored in a hypothetical matchup against Indiana, or Georgia would be favored in a hypothetical matchup against whatever this is. They live in the world of hypotheticals. I live in reality here. And if my big problem where I think their argument breaks down, if you're going to make that case, then you better make sure your entire house is in order, okay? It can't be a given that you're just going to win when you beat a terrible Kentucky team by 1 point, when you lost to Ole Miss by 18, an Ole Miss team that that lost to Kentucky, an Ole Miss team that lost to LSU, who lost to USC.
Tied in the fourth quarter against Florida, who's not very good.
So it's clearly not a given. We're talking about, we're looking at a Texas team, and when I'm watching the show, they have their key wins. Texas, their key wins. Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt lost to Georgia State, who's 0-6 in the Sun Belt. Vanderbilt lost to Arkansas, who lost to a 3-7 Oklahoma State team. And this is where, now just to, I'm venting a little bit, the preseason rankings matter. Oklahoma State was ranked at the time of that game. So we thought it changed our perspective of Arkansas. Now we know Oklahoma State isn't a great team at all. They've been struggling this year. So this is where we need to get Indiana in.
Right, and to reinforce your point, I mean, again, I understand the argument of they haven't beat a ranked team with Indiana. Neither has Texas.
Right.
And look where they are in this rankings, to your point, and they have a loss. Neither is SMU. Neither is Miami. Neither is Colorado. So all these teams that we're talking about as potential playoff teams are in the same boat that Indiana is. Look, I do think Indiana's got to play well.
Yes.
On Saturday, right? Because again, it's not your fault if your conference schedule falls in such a way that you play the teams that are at the bottom of the conference this year. Or maybe the better way to put it is you don't play the teams that are at the top of the conference. Indiana didn't make its conference
They're playing
schedule.
the two teams that were in the national title game last year.
Like,
right?
what an easy schedule.
Yes.
You get Michigan and Washington. Now, it's turned out that neither one of those teams is having a great year. But I do think then the onus is on you to play well in your opportunity against a really good team. And I do get that. And that part of it is challenging. I do think people would look at it differently. And to the credit of a lot of people out there who are in a position to kind of talk about these rankings, I think a lot of people are making the comparison to Michigan last year. And people gave Michigan the benefit of the doubt. And it turns out they gave them the benefit of the doubt with good reason, because Michigan was really good, because what we saw on the field was what turned out to be the best team in the country. But they also benefited from a pretty easy schedule early on in the year. They were in a similar position to Indiana. What's the difference between Michigan and Indiana? I think we all know what the difference is. One has incredible tradition. One had been in the playoff a couple years in a row, and so they had built up kind of this notion of being a championship caliber program and team. The other has really never been in a position like this.
Yeah, and everything, I'm with you. We're on the same page here. And Indiana can't control how their opponents play on their given schedule for that specific year, but they can control how they play those opponents. And they've dominated every single opponent. And I understand Michigan, the game was close a little bit, but Michigan still, in terms of talent, that's a really talented team. Indiana has dominated and taken full advantage of their opportunities. Again, I point out to Georgia. 1-point win over Kentucky. Indiana doesn't have that on their schedule. Every opportunity, I understand where these teams are at. They have dominated time and time again. So to me, and if you just watch the tape, it's undeniable that this is a great football team. I have questions maybe about their depth, but they've been able to remain relatively healthy. Their quarterback is playing as good as anybody in the country in Curtis Rourke. We've seen guys, we just don't know these names because it hasn't been years after years of development. But now when you look at the body of work this year, they have a number of players that are playing to all conference, even all American type standards.
All you have to do is look at that average margin of victory. As you said, it's better than 30 points per game, which is the highest in the country. Again, you think about teams that people are talking about, and I understand, like BYU's been controversial all along, right? And so then they lost last week to Kansas, and now it seems like the onus is on them too. You're going to need to win the Big 12 to get in. But just as a means of comparison, Indiana, 30 points per game, average margin of victory. BYU, 12. Boise State's a team that everyone is talking about as, wow, this is really an elite team. 19 points per game, playing in a far lesser conference than the Big Ten. Now, again, I understand strength of schedule-wise, it's pretty comparable. In fact, by some measurements, Boise State's strength of schedule is better than Indiana. So again, I'm not denigrating those teams. I am simply saying, look at what Indiana has done. Look at the degree to which they've beaten these teams, cognizant of the fact they're going to need to give a representative effort here coming up on Saturday against Ohio State to silence those doubters. I think they will. We'll talk about that matchup a little bit later in the show. I don't want to leave out the fact that Illinois made it into these rankings.
Yes.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Brett Bielema's team, which has 2 losses to top 4 teams in the country, and then aside from that, just the one loss to Minnesota.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Brett Bielema too, and rightfully so. Signetti has dominated the headlines: Coach of the Year, Conference Coach of the Year, National Coach of the Year. Understood. Brett Bielema has done a phenomenal job coaching this team once again, and you look at it now. We start to look forward, and I know we talked about it this week. They have a chance to go 9-3, and then to play in a big-time bowl game and get to 10 wins. That doesn't happen every day. This has
happened 4 times ever at Illinois.
And what did we say too going into this year? There's no more West. Now you have to play a challenging schedule. The entire floor has been elevated across college football in general. And what I really appreciate about the job Brett's done is usually when I think of a Brett Bielema team, they win because of their play in the trenches. That hasn't really been the case this year. They haven't been dominant from an offensive line or defensive line standpoint. The sign of a good coach is the ability to adapt. Altmaier clearly has taken steps every single year. Pat Bryant, how about Pat Bryant on senior day, the game he had? I think it was 135 yards, big touchdown early in the game. Zariah Franklin, Brett Bielema has done a great job of what every coach should do. What's the strength of my team, and what's the best formula to allow me to win? That's what's gotten them here. That's why they're ranked. And also, to this point, in terms of this playoff conversation as a whole, a team like Penn State is hoping Illinois continues to win, because the more Illinois wins, the better that win looks for Penn State.
All right, now you think about Illinois, the one thing they really haven't done this year is win consistently away from home. It's hard to do, and you consider they were at Oregon and they were at Penn State.
Yeah.
So it's challenging right there, right? But let's see what they do going to Rutgers this week. They play Northwestern at Wrigley Field, which I think will be more like a neutral site game than anything. But can you get a win at Rutgers? Can you get to 10 wins? But man, they are improved. You think about Luke Altmaier, the decision making this year, how much better it is than the decision making a year ago. Again, it's a testament to getting a guy in your system, identifying his strengths, and trying to get him to play away from his weaknesses.
How about that quarterback battle? Who would have thought? Altmaier and Callie-McManus. That's the headline of that game.
Right.
A quarterback battle. Right. It's going to be fun.
We'll get to that game a little bit later in the show. So much more to come, though, here on Big Ten Today. We've discussed the implications of Indiana and Ohio State, but how about the matchup itself? Jake and I are going to break that down. Plus, what will the removal of Phil Longo mean for the Badgers' struggling offense? The impact of in-season changes coming up. This is Big Ten Today. The Oregon Ducks are Indy-bound. The Big Ten announcing yesterday that Oregon had mathematically locked up a spot in the Big Ten championship game. The conference ran every scenario and the tiebreakers, and they determined that the worst the Ducks could do would be to finish second in the league. There are 10 tiebreaker scenarios in all. In 8 of them, they'd face either Ohio State or Indiana, but Penn State does still have a narrow path. Here are the Big Ten standings. Up to the minute, you see the Ducks and the Hoosiers on top. Oregon has a bye this week before finishing against Washington. Ohio State and Penn State behind them. And remember, the Buckeyes beat the Nittany Lions in State College. Then 3 teams at 4-3 in the league: Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. This subtle reminder, Saturday Big Ten tailgate in Columbus to set the scene for the Hoosiers and Buckeyes, as well as the rest of the day around the conference. Mike Hall, Tyvis Powell get things going. 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 Pacific, only on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app. The Buckeyes will go into that game shorthanded. Some really tough news, as numerous media outlets are reporting that OSU starting center Seth McLaughlin is out for the year after tearing his Achilles in practice yesterday. McLaughlin transferred from Alabama. He's had a great year, was a mid-season All-American. He is the second O-lineman the Bucks have lost. He joins left tackle Josh Simmons. So Seth McLaughlin, a guy who I think was under the microscope a little bit after his struggles for Alabama in the CFP last year with the snaps. He makes the move over to Ohio State. Man, he has played well. Just heartbreaking to see that. I know you have experienced a lot of injuries in your career, so certainly our heart goes out to him. What does this mean from an Ohio State team that, again, already has had to shuffle this offensive line once this year?
Well, it's a big deal, and my heart goes out to Seth, like you said, because I made the point calling the game last week, and then I felt we don't talk about transfer portal additions specifically for the offensive line as much. I thought he was one of the most impactful, if not the most impactful non-skill position transfer in college football. The Buckeye offensive line had been limited. That was what limited their ceiling in recent years. And he was a stable piece. Talking to Ryan Day and Chip Kelly, his leadership. The center position is so important. All communication starts from the inside out, okay? And he had a nasty streak. And the way Chip Kelly, they do their run scheme, they put a lot on that center, almost like a Jason Kelsey with the Eagles, where you have to snap the ball and occasionally you're pulling around. You have to have the ability to be athletic to pull around in space. You have to be nasty to be able to dig guys out on the inside. So this is a huge loss. And this is one of the big matchups this weekend because Indiana's defensive line and their defensive front, it's one of the more disruptive fronts in the conference as a whole. Sacks, TFLs, ability to win one-on-one matchups. This is a huge, huge deal. Very few teams can overcome losing one of their star offensive linemen. Now you lose two. Josh Simmons was likely a top 50 pick. Seth McLaughlin playing at an All-American level. Like he might have been the first center taken in the draft next year. I don't know. I don't know. I do know this. Because when Simmons went down, Donovan Jackson went from left guard out to left tackle. Carson Hinsman then had been playing left guard. He played center last year.
Yes.
So the positive in this is, you can put guys in at offensive line. Center's a different beast because of your ability to snap the ball and communicate. The positive is Carson Hinsman has experience snapping the ball.
As the starting center, right?
Exactly.
Not as a backup. I mean, he was their starting center last year.
And played well.
Right.
So that's at least, you could say, because center is a whole different game. At least you have someone with experience there. But make no mistake, this is a big, big deal. Understanding Ohio State wants to run the ball first. That's been the storyline all year. It's something to watch. It's really something to watch, but this is not the Indiana team of the past. Like that defensive line is disruptive, they're dynamic, and they're mean. That's going to decide this game, frankly.
Okay, so you've seen both these teams in person. You saw Ohio State as recently as 5 days ago at Wrigley Field. So give me a sense of like where each team has the edge here.
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State, this is, the way I see this is, if Ohio State plays their best game and Indiana plays their best game, Ohio State's going to win. I just think that that's where they're at as a program from a talent standpoint, from a resource standpoint. But no one plays their best game for 60 minutes. There's going to be mistakes and there's going to be opportunities. Where Ohio State has the edge, I believe, offensively, the outside. Guys like Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, you can go down the list. Their skill positions as well. Indiana's Pons is probably their best corner. He's 5'9". Like they don't have great size to necessarily match up with a guy like Jeremiah Smith. That being said, they're still going to want to run the ball. So with Indiana, the goal is to win the early downs, try to force Will Howard and that offense into third and longs. When Indiana has the football, I think they have the advantage on the outside. Denzel Burke, I look at him and I look, when I watch Denzel Burke move, he's a $100 million NFL corner. But he hasn't played like that at times. Oregon was able to get after it. Igbinosun, the other corner, he's a guy you love to have on your team. He's extremely aggressive to a fault at times. He's been, whether it's third down, fourth down, he's been good for one critical error PI in big situations a game. Got to clean that up in this one because I love Curtis Rourke. Is a gamer. That dude is a stone cold killer. He's going to stand in there. He stood in there in the pocket, took a shot by Mason Graham and delivered like a 50-yard strike to Elijah Surratt down the sideline. I like both teams' ability to throw the ball. I think both teams are going to have success throwing the ball. Which team can dominate and win in the trenches and run the ball to control the clock?
It does feel like Ohio State's running it a lot better here, 170-plus yards in each of the last 3 games after they went for 201 total in the previous 2. So we'll see whether or not that run game continues against what is a very good Indiana defense. I am interested to see if Ohio State's defense struggles because, as you mentioned, like if you look at kind of what's the one game this year where one of these units had a tough time, it's Ohio State's defense in that Oregon game. Now, you could say it's also Indiana's offense in the Michigan game, right? Which certainly in that second half, they didn't move the ball great. So I know you can kind of poke holes in each one of those teams, but that's the one that I wonder about. Last 4 games, Ohio State's been great. They've given up 2 offensive touchdowns the last 4 games. So they have really played well, but you do look back on that Oregon game, and again, Indiana is as dynamic as they come offensively. I mean, this is the second highest scoring team in the country.
And Ohio State's Jim Knowles has made some changes, and we saw the 3-down look a little bit against Purdue. They've made some changes. Jim Knowles he's an aggressive coordinator in general. I've noticed him, and I pointed it out against Northwestern, being even more aggressive, like bringing pressure. I look at that defensive line. That's an NFL defensive line. They should be able to win organically just bringing 4-man pressure, but for whatever reason, that hasn't been the case consistently. So Knowles is going to bring pressure. Curtis Rourke's decision-making is key. They run that RPO system, which is just like a game of math and space and leverage, and he makes great decisions. So the boogeyman, that's the one you got to keep an eye for. Caleb Downs solves problems.
Right.
Like you think you have space, you're running, it's great. Hey, coach, I'm going to get a first down. You look up, waving and say, hey, mom, how's it going? There's Caleb Downs, and he just smokes. He comes out of nowhere. So he's a guy that can change the game. Turnovers will be another thing, too. That's been a big emphasis for the Buckeyes defense.
I want to move on from this game, but I have one last question for you. How much do you think the fact that Ohio State has been there and Indiana hasn't will have an impact in this game? And I don't mean the programs. I mean the individual players. Like the Ohio State guys have all already played in huge games. This year. Obviously the Oregon game was immense for them, and then they had their backs up against the wall going to State College. I mean, that was a huge game. Indiana just hasn't had anyone who has played in a game of this magnitude at all on this roster.
There's 2 ways to look at it. For Ohio State first, they've played in big games, and Sonny Styles said this in a podcast last week. He said, we know what it's like to win games and lose the ones that matter down the stretch. I think that pain has made Ohio State come even closer together. That's a senior-heavy team that has experienced loss and are committed to winning the process. For Indiana, there's 2 ways to look at it. You could say the inexperience hurts you, or you could say, hey, you just go play free. You've earned the right to play confident. One thing, so Indiana's going on the road, they're traveling. You'll as a team, you'll have Friday night meetings, okay? So you'll eat dinner and then you'll go through your Friday night meetings. And each team has a specific department to make like a hype video. You always watch a hype video.
Right.
And it doesn't matter, sure. It's a subtle thing that it reminds you of who you are and what you're capable of. That hype video for the Hoosiers is gonna be absolutely special. Cignetti called his shots last December. And every single day, they've been working to reinforce that belief. I think this is a team, they got nothing to lose. No one's giving them a chance on the outside looking in. I believe they're very capable. I think all that makes them, this is a dangerous team because they're capable and they're counted out.
They are certainly counted out, right? I mean, no one operates with more of a chip on his shoulder than Curt Cignetti, right? He is trying to prove to the world that they made a mistake waiting until he was in his 60s to hire him as a head coach at a Power 5 school. And I feel like he wakes up every day trying to prove to everyone they were wrong. And then you think of where all these players came from, right? These aren't guys who were playing at Alabama and said, hey, I'm not making it here, or Ohio State or Michigan or wherever, and I'm going to go to Indiana. No, these are guys who, a few from the ACC and whatever, but I mean, they were basically talking about a group of 5 guys.
Yes, exactly.
So they all feel like they've
With
been slighted too.
Absolutely.
It's a massive chip.
It's going to be fun.
It is really going to be fun. Hey, I do want to ask you about Penn State. I mentioned they still have a chance to get to Indy. It's a narrow path. A lot of it is out of their control. But what is in their control, I would say, is making it to the college football playoff here. If they win out, it feels like they're going to be in. This is a tricky game against Minnesota. What are you watching there against the Gophers?
Yeah, I'm watching the maturity first, because Penn State is a team where the only thing that's changed, let's say it goes according to plan and they go to the playoffs. Cool, you can celebrate that you went to the playoffs, but really the only thing that would change is the label of being able to be called a playoff team. This is a game, if Minnesota could be, if Missouri's ranked in the SEC, Minnesota has a case to be ranked, okay? Like they've done some nice things this year. They got hot for a little while. They're a dangerous team. The secondary of Penn State has to show up, because what's crazy, Minnesota, under Brosmer, they're a pass-first team. Like, he's been leading them, and they're dangerous throwing the ball. I'm curious to see what the secondary does, because the further we go in the season, the playoffs, there's some great quarterbacks and great skill positions. And then for Drew Aller, it's the same thing where this guy's got all the talent in the world. You look at him, you say, that's an NFL quarterback with an NFL arm. He had his moment earlier. USC rose to the occasion, led his team on a big drive, and left USC with the win. This is another one of those opportunities where you're going on the road, a critical game. All of our resources are spent talking about Ohio State, Indiana, and some of the play. It's been quiet what Penn State has done in recent weeks. Drew Aller has to lead his team to victory.
And it won't be easy. This is a talented Minnesota defense. They have gone back to being an elite defense. So you talk about what went wrong last year for Minnesota, and you can talk about quarterback play, and it wasn't great. It's hard to disagree with that. But to me, the biggest issue was they were not an elite defense. They were an average to slightly below average defense, and that just isn't what they've been under P.J. Fleck. But they're top dozen in the nation now. Once again, total defense, scoring defense, they're really good. So it's a challenge for Drew Aller.
Minnesota, last year, they were out of position. I just didn't think there was a trust for the 11 guys on the field. This year, they're almost all on a string. All 11 guys are playing as one unit, which makes it really hard to beat them.
It should be a really interesting game there, and they'll be charged up in Minneapolis. Up next, it was an off-season of change in the Big Ten. We knew that coming in. But an in-season of change as well, as it turns out. Jake and I will look at the most impactful moves coming up. Saturday, we have a football doubleheader here on the Big Ten Network, kicking off with Iowa against Maryland. And Jake will be in Lincoln for Wisconsin and Nebraska. Coverage begins with Big Ten Tailgate live from Columbus, 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 Pacific. That is Saturday, only on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app. In case you missed it, over the weekend, Wisconsin announcing on Sunday that it had parted ways with offensive coordinator Phil Longo. Longo was hired by Luke Fickell at the outset of his tenure at the beginning of last season, bringing in an air raid attack, which has largely been grounded. The Badgers 11th in the Big Ten in scoring. Fickell on what it means going forward.
The basic gist, what I told the team, it's not about play calls. It's not about points scored. It's not about touchdowns. It's moving forward with leadership. And that's, to me, what we have to do and why we're doing it right now. We got to continue to build upon the things that we've done. And that's where it's not like, hey, how are you going to do this? Are you going to change? Like, no, the idea is this is a progression, right? Regardless of who's actually calling the plays, the progression is how you continue to evolve the offense in particular for what best fits Wisconsin. And what best fits Wisconsin is using the things that you do have. And, I don't think that means you deviate from a ton of different things that we've done. But we know that we got to continue to grow and progress and be multiple in what we're doing. And, it won't change this week or next week or, that much different as we move forward.
So again, you're going to have this game on Saturday. That was interesting. At one point in that news conference, Fickell was asked who would actually be calling plays. Yeah. And his response was, why does it matter? Which is an interesting approach. Yeah. I think his point was, and he kind of went on to say, well, what are you looking for who you'd point a finger at if it doesn't go well? So I think he's not saying it doesn't matter internally who's calling plays. Clearly it does, although he said it would be a collaborative approach. But I think he said basically, I don't need you to know. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, it felt to me like there was a disconnect between Fickell and Longo. And what he's talking about there and what Coach Fickell was saying is, leadership. And he wants the I just get the sense he wants the players to take this over, and he wants the players to make this theirs. In fairness, 2 years now they've went to the transfer portal to get a quarterback. That's your key leader. 2 years their quarterback, who they were relying on, who spent all offseason as the leader in the locker room, has gotten hurt. Yep. I get it. What I make of it is, and it's true for both these teams, Nebraska and Wisconsin, both defenses have played good enough to win games. Both defenses, not perfect. Look at Wisconsin. The defense gave them every chance against Oregon. Gave them every chance even against Penn State. which offense can find a rhythm? Because that's another piece of this is I haven't seen any rhythm out of Nebraska. It feels like they're trying certain things and nothing's clicked. For Wisconsin, when they were successful in that 3-game stretch, there was balance. I believe they can run the ball. I like Tawee Walker. I don't think he's to the standard of some of the all-time great Wisconsin backs, but he's proven that he's capable. The offensive line has proven that they're capable. They got to find some type of balance, though. So that's why you kind of make one of these changes here, is to try to capture some of that potential.
Dana Holgorsen, the longest tenured offensive coordinator in that game.
So. Whoa, that's good. Yeah, good point. Right. Yes, that's one way to put it.
That tells you a little bit about what's going on between those two. It has been a year of significant changes in the Big Ten. We've seen some of these coaching changes. Obviously, you're dealing with a game this week where both offensive coordinators have switched here within the last couple of weeks. We had a lot of players who were in certain positions at the outset of the year who aren't there now. So we wanted to go through some of the more impactful changes. And I know by impactful, you kind of want to define it as impacting the league as a whole, as well as impacting their team.
Yes.
So let's go through some of those. I think it makes sense to start with another coordinator change. And one you're going to see this week.
Yeah, let's start. Okay, we'll start with Nebraska hiring Holgorsen, right, and bringing him in as an outside voice to look at things from a 20,000-foot view, and then ultimately Matt Rule says, "Here, this is yours now." And why this could be impactful is we've seen at Raiola earlier in the year. We're saying, is this guy a top 3 or 4 quarterback in the league already? Like, these flashed some type of potential. And what I like about Holgorsen, and I listened to his pressers this week. He was calling everybody out. He was calling the running backs out, saying, yeah, you got to make guys miss. Like, it's not been good enough. He's calling out the wide receivers. They got big, physical, strong wide receivers, saying, hey, you guys got to block. You got to help us out a little bit. And for Nebraska, as you're chasing that next level, it reminds me of when Jim Harbaugh got to Michigan. We were just stuck at average. You need to be uncomfortable, okay? You earn the right to be comfortable. Nebraska hasn't earned the right to be comfortable. I think it's very positive that Holgorsen's coming in and calling out his players, challenging them to try to elicit a response so they can reach some of that potential. They got to get to 6, man. I mean, seriously, to start 5-1 and to lose the way you lost to Illinois, you have got to get to 6. The same is true for Wisconsin, but for this sake, Holgorsen can make a huge impact.
Right. It's a little different, though, when you're talking about a program that hasn't been to a bowl game in 7 straight years versus one that's been to a bowl game for 2 decades plus.
Yes.
Right. I mean, like, the pressure is certainly on Nebraska, and they have not ducked from that at all. It'll be interesting to see the impact because you're right. I mean, Holgorsen has been very blunt. And when you parachute in somewhere and then you tell people, here's what's wrong, here's what's wrong, here's what's wrong, you need to make sure that the message hits in the right way. And I'm sure that Matt Rule is doing a lot to make sure that it does, and that the players understand that it's coming from a place of, hey, we're trying to get better here. Okay, so we talked about the offensive line change at Ohio State, and now we see with Seth McLaughlin, there's another change, but that's been really impactful in terms of the injuries earlier this year.
Critically impactful. And I point out the most recent national champions. Last year you have Washington, who won the Joe Moore Award, playing Michigan, who has won the Joe Moore Award the previous 2 years, right? You have got to win in the trenches. Ohio State has all these beautiful skill positions and weapons, but the trenches are the engine. They did a great job of reshuffling a little bit, and they found something in that final 5 minutes. The way they finished the game against Penn State was really encouraging. And now they're building, and this is a big-time injury. And for Ryan Day, this is an amazing opportunity for him. This is what you get paid to do as a head coach, is to find a way to rally your troops. It's interesting to me, Dave, the last time they won a national championship, they dealt with injuries down the stretch as well. Mm-hmm. Quarterback, it was different, right? Cardale Jones,
multiple quarterback injuries.
And they found a way because the team came together. That's going to be the challenge here for the Buckeyes, is can they come together now, losing another key player?
I think what's frightening is when they had the left tackle change earlier in the year, the original switch really didn't work.
No.
And so your margin for error isn't great, because this is a massive game against a really good team. So you've got to make sure you get it right this week. And the fact that this injury happened early in the week, it is really challenging. Not the only offensive line that's had to make some changes this year. And this next one we're going to talk about in Oregon, to me, like, this changed their season.
Yep.
And so as a byproduct, it changed the whole league.
Yeah, I mean, it just, like, the split in time, you're looking at the first 2 weeks, Oregon had 7 sacks through the initial 2 weeks. Since then, 5 sacks. Talk about a big difference. And what's really been important, especially in recent weeks, is they lost Tez Johnson, their top wide receiver. You don't know what the health is going to be. Dylan Gabriel isn't Ben Roethlisberger in terms of size. You do not want him to get hit. He's not really built to take a ton of hits. So the offensive line has to protect him. They have got to be able to run the ball. The offensive line will decide ultimately the future of Oregon's season. So I look at them, the more they can run the ball, the more they can get into play action. The better the windows are for Dylan Gabriel being a shorter guy. Like, if you could run the ball and get into play action, all of a sudden he's going to have vision of the field. So to me, I think trench play in general is underrated for the Ducks. D-line, probably the most underrated D-line in the conference. But the offensive line, after those initial changes and with health, has really, really been impressive. They're a physical unit.
There was the one area of weakness
Yes.
in those first couple of games, and it has turned into a strength, as you said. By the way, I don't know if you saw Tez's social media this
Yes.
week, but it sounds like he is going to be back.
Yes.
Not great news for Washington,
Right.
but fabulous news for Oregon fans. We've seen a couple of QB moves as well.
Yeah.
Where would you start there?
Okay, we'll start with USC and talk about Jane Maiava. And it was immediately apparent what he can do for this offense, specifically running the ball. Okay, 3 passing touchdowns, 1 rushing touchdown. And it felt almost like his ability to run had ripple effects for their offense as a whole. This team is so much more talented than their record. I mean, my goodness, they could have 8 or 9 wins right now, in a parallel universe somewhere. They probably do. And part of what has limited them is their inability to run the ball and their lack of commitment to run the ball as well. It feels like Lincoln Riley is just much more comfortable committing to that run and also calling pass plays, knowing Maiava can run and solve problems with his legs.
And the offensive line had a lot to do with their issues, and this mitigates the impact of a struggling offensive line, right?
Yes.
If you have a guy who can scramble a little bit like Maiava can. One more quarterback change you want to get to.
Yep, Michigan. And again, why this matters, and this is to the initial point, Michigan's success or failure affects the entirety of the conference. Because here we are talking about Indiana and their lack of major wins. Had Michigan, played better this year, that would have been a key win. Maybe it would have changed the result. But for Michigan, that quarterback play, the roller coaster they've been on this entire season, it feels like, hindsight's 2020, they should have stuck with Davis Warren from the jump. But since they've came back to him, I think they've settled everyone else down around. They've been able to find their identity. And all of a sudden, I know Ohio State had their hands full this weekend against Indiana. I know this all too well. Freshman year in 2013, Ohio State was top 5 in the country. We were unranked. We took them down to the wire, 42-41. Anything can happen in that game. But if Michigan wants to win that game, they need quality quarterback play. I believe they have gotten at least quality quarterback play from Davis Warren.
We'll circle back a little bit more on that game as we continue on the show. It is time for 4 we're watching for. Big things we'll be watching this weekend. Ashley and I typically do this on Wednesday, but Jake gets his shot at it today.
Excited.
Where are you starting?
I'm starting with Curt Cignetti, Under the Lights. How could it be anything else? It's like divine in nature. It's prophetic. He called out Purdue. That was obvious. But he called out Michigan. Okay, they took him down. Called out Ohio State. Here's what it is. I want to see Curt Cignetti under the lights.
I'm with you. This is the biggest story, not just in the Big Ten this weekend. It's the biggest story in all of college football. So anything that I'm going to say pales in comparison. Yes. That's the biggest thing.
Imagine if they do it.
That's be incredible. It's the biggest thing that I'm watching for as well this weekend. Okay, so cognizant of the fact that that's the biggest thing, we'll go for a few others. I'm interested in Iowa's quarterback situation.
Okay.
Brendan Sullivan seemed to give them a shot in the arm until he kind of didn't last time out. He really struggled. Then he got hurt. So now Cade McNamara is back at the top of the depth chart, although Kirk Ferentz was a little circumspect, I thought, in his news conference yesterday. So who knows who's actually going to start a quarterback. But if it is Cade, he's got to avoid the mistakes. Like early in the year, Maryland, when they were playing pretty well, they turned people over.
Yeah.
he cannot allow that to happen in this game.
That's probably why Kirk was a little bit hesitant to just hand him the keys right away. Caleb Johnson needs some help. You know, Brendan Sullivan isn't Peyton Manning back there, but what he did was help him out a little bit. I'll keep it going here, the momentum with the quarterback duel that who would have thought? Luke Altmaier and Ethan Kaliak-Manis. That's going to be a fun one. Both guys are playing great, especially Kaliak-Manis is playing great. I like what those young receivers are doing. That's just a fun little matchup, an underrated matchup this weekend.
How about Altmaier? 18 touchdown passes, only 3 picks. He was a turnover machine last year. It's a big part of the reason why Illinois is a better team this year than they were a year ago. I'm going to keep it in quarterbacks and just kind of offense in general. I'm interested to see whether the bye week benefited Michigan's offense. I mean, you think about the last time we saw them, their defense was great against Indiana, the best anyone's played against them. The longest play for their offense was 16 yards.
It's just insane, right?
It's crazy. And I do think, like, Northwestern is an above-average defense. I think that Michigan's defense will make things miserable for Northwestern offensively, but Northwestern's defense can give them problems. Michigan needs to make sure that they don't make mistakes.
Absolutely.
And are they better offensively? This was a ton of fun.
It was.
You are back tomorrow, correct? All right. Also on the show, Kiki Rice and Joel Klatt. I'll be doing hoops tomorrow, but you should watch the show anyway. It'll be great. See you then.